Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming along. My name is Sophie Robinson. I am Business Development Manager for Beauty, Wellbeing, but also Textiles at Soil Association Certification. This morning, I'm going to talk to you about fibre and fabrics and regeneration. So first of all, I'd like to give you a little bit of an oversight about Soil Association Certification and what it is that we do. Soil Association was founded in 1947 by a group of farmers who were really concerned with the way that we were beginning to farm following the Second World War. And this was because there was suddenly an enormous increase in the number of chemical inputs that were being used in order to produce food. And this was in part in response directly after the Second World War to there being more nitrogen available because of munitions factories. But then as the Cold War started to develop, it also became a way to show communist countries that actually we were self-sufficient and we were able to provide enough food for our country using these methods. So throughout this time, Soil Association has campaigned government to change the way that we farm, primarily to do with food, and then has begun to offer charity and support to people to make sure that they do indeed have access to food. Now obviously you can't get anything in a vacuum, and we don't just farm food, we also farm ingredients for cosmetics and of course fibres for fashion and textiles. So as part of this, in the early 2000s, they began working on expanding their certification from simply food into textiles and cosmetics, and one of the things that they did as part of this was to begin with another group of certification bodies and leaders in the textiles industry to found GOTS, which is the Global Organic Textiles Standard. Now the idea here was to create something demonstrable that fabrics could be, or fibres could be held up against, in order to say, is this product truly organic? Has it been grown organically? Has it then been processed in a way that doesn't put enormous impacts on the environment? And also, is there a social aspect to this? Are the people that are working in these factories or the farmers, are they being treated fairly? So this is where the GOTS standard sort of came from. Now we certify in a textiles point of view to GOTS, and also we do OCS, the Organic Content Standard too. So the subject for this particular talk, regeneration, is sort of reflecting on the fact that we, I think, have all become much more aware of the extreme impacts that the fashion industry particularly, but textiles as a whole, have on the environment. And this is particularly obvious in younger generations, Gen Z sort of becoming the poster child, I suppose, for actually protesting and making comments on what we are doing with the environment, what our relationship is with it. But then conversely, this is the generation that's also being marketed to the most by these big fast fashion brands. So, what's the problem? I think you're probably all here because you have concerns around fast fashion. So let's explore fast fashion a little bit. The term was originally coined in the early 1990s by the New York Times to describe Zara's new initiative of taking an item of clothing from design all the way to being on the shelves within 15 days. In reality, we are now looking at more like 10 days, which is an insanely intensive process. Fast fashion generally refers to cheap, usually low quality items which are produced and designed to meet the latest fashion trends and doesn't really take into account social issues or environmental issues. We often think of this as being something that happens abroad, typically Bangladesh and India. This would be considered to be places where people are creating fashion items under very, very poor conditions with very little regard for human health. However, I think in the pandemic it really highlighted quite how poorly we treat garment workers in the UK. There was a lot of scandals coming out about warehouse workers in Leicester, for example. And I think that actually that really helped bring it home to people and realise that this is a global problem. It's not just remote, it is something that affects all of us directly and is still happening in a country that we like to think is quite civilised and perhaps above that sort of thing. So social media and online shopping have become really clear drivers for fast fashion because you are able to just order something very, very cheaply and have it turn up right there. And social media, you know, this whole idea of always being seen in a different item of clothing, always being extremely on trend. Now, very often people sort of blame the consumer for this, but I don't think that that is the case. If you think of the notorious £1 boohoo bikini, oh no, sorry, was it boohoo? Might have been misguided. Anyway, the £1 fast fashion bikini, and the fact that companies very often have partnerships with shows like Love Island, for example, to sort of create their own trends. So it's not just the consumer always being hungry for more, it's actually these companies driving this constant need for new trends. Historically, we always had 2 seasons, you know, spring, summer, autumn, winter. But trend research has actually shown that we're now up to 52 micro-trends. That's a new trend every week of the year, which to me is completely insane. And this really helps to bolster the fashion industry. So searches for cheap clothes, for example, went up 46.3% in the first lockdown because people are being shown constantly that they can always be seen as fresh and new. And then you have things like Klarna, which make it really easy for us to buy products even if perhaps we can't afford it. You can push that payment down the road a little bit. It is expected that the fashion industry will be worth $3 trillion by 2030, which is just an insane number. And it just completely blows my mind that actually this is one of the most polluting industries in the world, and we're just continuing to feed into it. And I think a large part of that is due to the fact that it's very much kept at arm's length. We're not really informed about how these products are made and, you know, what is happening within it. So this is basically an open-ended economy. We're encouraged to buy, always have the latest thing, and then dispose of it and get a new one. And this obviously isn't a sustainable solution that's going to carry on long term. In 2021, it was estimated that 92 million tonnes of fabric waste are created each year, and that's expected to reach 134 million tonnes by 2030. These numbers are absolutely mind-boggling. You can't really conceptualise that. You can't imagine what that actually looks like. So if you really want to be quite depressed about the state of the fashion world, you can do what I did and Google the Atacama clothing mountain. So this is in a desert in Chile, and it is very often where huge quantities of clothing that have just been disposed of, often actually through like recycle schemes, end up. And that is honestly one of the most horrifying images I think I've seen in regards to fashion. So it might surprise you to know that fashion is actually responsible for 10% of global carbon emissions. So that, to put it in context, is actually double shipping and aviation combined. We hear a lot about our impacts when we are flying somewhere, but we don't necessarily think about our carbon impacts when we're buying a new shirt to look cute at the weekend. It's also responsible for 20% of global wastewater, which is about 93 billion cubic metres, or, in real terms, the consumption needs of 5 million people. And that's simply from textile dyeing, not even from, you know, growing fibres to create the textiles. The textiles industry is also responsible for 15% of global plastic usage. Only construction and packaging use more plastic than the textiles industry. And what's the reason for this? Well, it's quite simple. Polyester costs half the amount to produce than the equivalent of conventional cotton. We're not even talking organic cotton here, but actually normal conventional cotton. And of course this is a larger problem because plastics shed microplastics which then end up in our environment, in our water streams. We hear a lot about this sort of on a daily basis, but again we don't necessarily consider fabrics as being one of these things. I think often we also see that companies are using recycled plastics in their garments. However, a recent survey of the foremost worn fashion producers in Europe actually showed that on average 4% of their items, 4% of the makeup of the items that they say are recycled is actually recycled. which is insanely low, and it really highlights how careful you have to be. If something says this is made from recycled plastic, but only one of them was as low as 0.5% recycled plastic, that really highlights how easy it is to twist words. So clothing sales have doubled to 200 billion units a year since 2000. And this is only going to continue to grow if we carry on the way that we are. However, the average number of wears of a garment has reduced in that same period by 36%. On average, we only wear our clothes 14 times before we dispose of them. And I think that some research that The Guardian did in 2019 really sums this up. Of the young women that they asked, a third of them would consider an item of clothing to be old if it had been worn only once or twice. I think this is really an enormous mental change that we need to do, a switch about, what actually, can I go out in public wearing the same dress that I wear for the majority of my public speaking engagements, or do I need to buy a new one every single time? So let's talk a little bit about regeneration, and also how organic sort of fits into that bracket. So when we talk about regenerative, we mean something that takes into account all of the inputs and outputs and actually doesn't sort of end up in nothing. It doesn't end up in a pile of clothes in the middle of the Chilean desert. It comes back again. It's from soil to rail and back to soil again. Is it doing gross harm to our planet, or is it actually trying to reduce that within its system? So if I'm going to start with soil, which I will, because I'm from the Soil Association, conventional farming can very often lead to biodiversity loss, water runoff, pollution, increased emissions, soil erosion, because it's quite intensive and it's purely driven by putting inputs in to get the maximum yield at the end, rather than actually taking care of the soil and ensuring that it's healthy and therefore able to nourish growth. So organic farming can provide a solution to this because it requires the removal of harmful chemicals from the farming process, and the majority of these are actually created from petrochemicals in the first place. So by immediately removing that, you're actually beginning to cut down the amount of fossil fuels that you're using. It also generally requires less machinery, which again cuts that even further. It might surprise you to know that agriculture is actually one of the highest industries for greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, only just coming in behind textiles at 18.4% of our particular carbon emissions. Other advantages of organic soils actually can hold much more water, twice the amount of water than conventional soils, and this can both provide a solution to drought, because obviously if your soil is already well hydrated, you're less likely to be impacted by drought, but also there's less water runoff because it's actually going in, and it can prevent flooding because it's more able to absorb. Recent research shows that if we were to farm organically broadly for the most part across Europe, so by increasing it by about 40 to 50%, if we followed organic principles, we should be able to reduce our greenhouse gas outputs by about 50% by 2030, which I think is quite marked. So you're not even looking at everybody following it, but actually if people begin to move towards a more organic, a more thoughtful way of doing things, you're really reducing these impacts very quickly. And I think another really interesting thing is that organic soil is 25% more effective at sequestering carbon and can hold on to it for about twice as long. So simply by nurturing the soil in the first place, before we even get on to all of the inputs that actually go into creating a garment, you're already sequestering and holding carbon in the soil. If we move on to the production process, which is primarily what we at Soil Association work on, both GOTS and the Organic Context Standard aren't farming standards, they are processing standards. So basically these take effect when you move into the ginning process onwards. And what they do to try to support the environment is have very clear standards around the sort of colorants and auxiliary chemicals that you can actually use in processing. So this means that, you know, obviously they are going to be required, but these are going to be less damaging. They're going to have also reviews around wastewater, how you're handling your wastewater. It's not able to just be dumped straight into a river, obviously. You've also got restrictions on fibre combinations to try to ensure the biodegradability of a product. And you will also review the toxicity of an end product before it goes out to make sure, again, that you've got a quality product that's not going to be leaching into the environment. And there are quality checks as well. So what this can do is actually make sure that a garment isn't being produced for 1 or 2 wears. It is designed with reuse in mind to be carried on. And there's also a level of social responsibility that comes with that. I mentioned it briefly before. So, for example, those warehouses in Leicester that we heard so much about would not be allowed underneath GOTS standard because there are social responsibilities in that you must be paid a fair wage. You must be able to, you know, leave of your own volition. This is something that you want to do, want to be involved in. Going back to sort of Bangladesh, there's no child labour allowed. There must be occupational health and safety carried out. You wouldn't want to be in, you know, it's deliberately designed to make sure that people are safe when they're working. So, the standards that we certify to do cover the processing, manufacturing, packaging, labelling, all the way through the entire process, and everything is being reviewed. I believe that to be regenerative, you do have to take certification into account because it's a third-party person that's coming in and checking. It doesn't necessarily have to be organic. There are many certifications out there that can be regenerative. And I think that regenerative is a really massive concept that isn't simply made up of one thing or even 2 things. It's all of these things working together to make something that's truly actually circular. But for me, starting with a quality fibre is the best way to get going. So the things that we primarily certify starts with cotton. It's the most widely known and used organic fibre. We estimate that there'll be a 48% increase in organic fibre production across this year, which is very good because there is an enormous demand and supply issue with it. People really want to be involved in organic cotton because it's quite an easy thing to be able to put on your label, especially if you can use a blend, which is something that people very often do. And it's meant that combined with organic standards speaking out against the use of slave labour in China, for example, that really reduced supply. There was also an issue of fraud at the agricultural level, which reduced supply again. So we've got a combination of supply being reduced and massive demand, which means that we really need more organic fibres to be coming through. So to talk about some of the other ones that I think can have their part in dealing with this supply issue, wool is a really nice one. I think wool is a fantastic fibre because it's not only an alternative fibre and something that can quite easily be produced organically, it also very often has a small supply chain. For example, we at Soil Association now certify a full supply chain from the farmer that produces the sheep to the processing facility to the garments. And that's all within the UK. You know, that hasn't had to come from halfway across the world. It's right here. The other great thing about sheep is they can be used as part of agroecology. So this is a method which farmers can use to ensure the health of their soil without using chemicals. So it's you know, basically utilising poo and rotating your fields to make sure that you are keeping nutrients within your soil and keeping bacteria and mycelium within your soil as well. Something else which was historically grown in the UK is linen. Now we see far less linen now, and this is because cotton really took over as a cheaper option, and also any linen production was generally moved abroad. And what this has meant is that we no longer have the tools that we would have historically used to harvest this linen. However, it is a really great option and is beginning to make a bit of a comeback. Fashion Revolution had a campaign with it recently. There's the I Love Linen campaign. You know, generally, I think linen can be a really good alternative fibre because it's quite easy to grow organically. And hemp is another one. Unfortunately, it suffers a bit from its association with cannabis, but it's an easily grown minimum input plant which can be very easily certified as organic. There are a great many things that can be organic, and as I've mentioned before, very often people use it as part of a blend. So I would always recommend that you're looking, if you are looking for organic, for a logo, something like GOTS or OCS, because actually what that does is it means there's a minimum percentage. So you can still have a blend, but you have to have 70% organic, because things like threads, for example, are very often quite difficult to produce organically. There are other ways, of course, outside of organic to make sustainable choices. It's just my favourite. So we all come back to this. The first one is wearing the clothes you already own, upcycling them, mending them, loving them, and only buying something that you truly love, rather than buying a new thing for every single occasion. Another really nice thing that I've seen coming to the fore recently is renting clothes for special occasions. I think that's such a lovely thing to do because, you know, who's going to wear a ball gown more than like twice in their life, realistically? I'd love to have occasion, but it doesn't come up often. Buying second-hand is, of course, a great way to reduce your impact. It's perhaps not truly regenerative, but it can help support circularity because you're actually supporting a second-hand economy, and you're not just creating a product and dumping it immediately. You're then using it and bringing it all the way through. Clothing made from recycled fabrics are also a really positive way to do things. I mean, this is actually the positive side of what I was talking about earlier, where sometimes companies will have recycle schemes and then things just end up in the middle of the desert somewhere. If it works, using certified recycled fabric is really great. I mentioned before that sometimes people will say this has recycled plastics or whatever else in it, but actually if you have a certification standard attached to it, it's a really clear and easy way to have a quick stamp and a quick check. So you could be looking at the recycled claims standard, for example, that actually checks the claims. The global recycled standard is really the tip-top thing to look out for, in my opinion. And their key aims are to reduce the harmful impact of production to people and the environment, provide assurance that products are processed more sustainably, and to drive higher percentages of recycled content in products. Regenerated nylon has come to the fore quite recently, so EcoNyl. What that means is it is recycled and reused and regenerative nylon, and I think that's very interesting. Nylon is quite positive because it does have a longer wear than some natural fibres do, so actually you do have to sort of have a consideration about this, although this isn't particularly my area. And from that as well you have man-made cellulosic fibres. So these are things like viscose or rayon. What it means is they're produced from cellulose, very often wood, sometimes bamboo is a good one. So bamboo is very, very quick to grow and uses minimal inputs, so can be a really, really good base for these products. However, they do take high chemical inputs. So basically you get a wood or a cellulose pulp and you mix it with a certain type of chemicals and force it through a very, very fine mesh to make the fibre. And obviously any time you're using a very intense level of chemicals, you do have to have a bit of a worry. So from this, Tencel, that's the sort of TM side of things, which is either called Lyocell or modal. It's similar to rayon or viscose, but it uses sort of better chemicals, I suppose, less harsh, less toxic chemicals to achieve the same effect. One of the things that I'm really pleased to see happening as well is slow fashion. So something, business models whereby you sort of see a concept and then you order the concept and then it is made for the number of people that are actually going to purchase it. This massively reduces waste because, of course, we've just been talking about garments, but offcuts are a huge waste as well. And again, products made with offcuts are a great thing to do too. So just to really nail down the key points of how not to be tricked. Greenwashing can be a real problem in the industry because it's quite unregulated. It's very easy to make a lot of these claims that I've spoken about without actually having anything to back them up. So it's really important that you are informed and able to recognise greenwashing. So I think a key one, which has been demonstrated beautifully within the last week, is the media grab. I don't know if any of you have seen that Kourtney Kardashian is the sustainability ambassador of Boohoo, which I think is fantastic. I mean, she does know a lot about sustainability. So basically, if we look at this, if we break it down, I saw it on the tube when I was coming down to London at the beginning of the week, and I thought, interesting, Boohoo are being sustainable. And I had a look, And of their 40,000 different products that they release each year, her wardrobe is a 45-piece capsule wardrobe. And the majority of them, 41 of them, do contain recycled plastics. But again, this is only a percentage. So, you know, we've got this great big media grab of Kourtney Kardashian, but what, in reality, is it doing? I've already mentioned returns initiatives and the fact that they can be returned to landfill. A recent Textiles Exchange report showed that 52% of companies practicing this return system had little to no knowledge of where these garments actually ended up. I think something that's really easy to do is look out for vague language. Does the label just say conscious? Does it just say made with recycled plastic? Even the term regenerative is something to really look out for, because it doesn't legally mean anything yet. And I think, again, mixed composition is that made with organic cotton. How much of that garment is organic? Is it just 20%? Or have they actually gone through the trouble of having it certified and getting up to a much higher percentage? So, just to come back to it again, my main piece of advice is look for that reputable third-party certification for whatever concern it is that you are looking for, because that's an easy, quick check, and you know that somebody has gone through all of the rigorous checks and made sure that everything is up to standard before putting that stamp on it. Really, the thing is to inform yourself, it's to ask questions, and I think it's to hold brands to account. There is no perfect solution to the situation that we're in at the moment, but it definitely starts with mixing all of these approaches together to create something that's regenerative. And actually, we are currently at a point where we can define what that's going to be at the end. So I think everybody needs to work together to create something measurable and that will actually make a difference in the long run. I think we might have a couple of seconds for some questions. I spoke for much longer than I was expecting to. Do you guys want to ask me anything? Okay.
I've actually got a few things. One seems quite interesting because from the meat production side of things, lamb is like really high carbon footprint. So how does the carbon footprint of kind of wool production kind of measure up in terms of, you know, obviously because I think it's because they produce greenhouse gas themselves, possibly more than that.
It sort of depends where you're getting your information from, as with all of these things. And it's also about taking it in isolation. So if you're looking at an organic farm, you're not simply looking at the footprint of that land, you're actually looking at the footprint of everything that's being grown on that land. And by farming in a way that supports soil health and allows it to sequester more, you actually, under some reports, can end up coming out carbon negative. So I know there's been a lot of press recently, especially about regenerative farming and removing animals from that conversation, but I think practically, and also to a certain extent scientifically, you can use animals within the farming system to support soil health and to sequester carbon. Does that help?
I'm not sure. I mean, it was kind of in the context of organic farming, but I was kind of seeing the hierarchy of kind of carbon footprint thing. So, possibly three fibres that you didn't mention, or three textiles you didn't mention. So silk, leather, and also you're thinking about there's an awful lot of elastic produced, and kind of underwear is an interesting one because it's really hard to get underwear that works, that doesn't contain man-made fibres. So, you know, is rubber kind of, where is that on the spectrum? So, yeah, I've got three things I'm kind of asking you about.
Very, very good point. So, leather, I think that was the second one. We'll start there. Leather does need an awful lot of chemicals to get it to the standard. We looked at organic leather probably about 15 years ago, and it was just basically impossible to produce without an enormous amount of chemical. It's a bit like bamboo, viscose or rayon, like it's a similar sort of thing. You need so many inputs that actually that's something that we decided not to go with because it ended up being more harmful in the end. Silk is an interesting one because it's difficult to produce a significant amount of it, if you see what I mean, because you've got these little tiny silkworms, obviously, so it's difficult to scale up, I think, and it also has a certain amount of social things attached to it. But I don't know a huge amount about silk, to be honest with you, because I tend not to work with it, but they would be my comments on that. And then the last one was rubber. Again, it's not something that we usually work with, so I can't give you too much info on it. But no, you're right, that's an interesting one to think on, so I will take that away. Sorry.
So, you said when you look at a garment and it says like, oh, this contains like organic cotton, but it's always like normally like a certain percentage. Do most companies actually state that percentage from what you find, or would you say that they don't? It would just, if you look on the label, it would just say 100% cotton. It wouldn't give you like the breakdown.
They should say the percentage of what the product is made up of, but if it's made with organic cotton, they then don't have to, unless they're certified, say 50% of this cotton is organic. They'll just say this is made from this much cotton. Yeah? Cool. Great, well thank you so much for coming. Yeah, very happy to chat afterwards. Thanks.